So you're off to Yorkshire this weekend then?
I am. Friday morning, Dave.
Is that where you come
nice
from?
weekend away. Well, no. I'm half Yorkshire. My dad was born in Yorkshire.
Right.
But we're actually off to see some friends in Kirby Moorside.
Oh.
Yorkshire was not been there for a few years.
Gorgeous part of the world.
Yeah. Nice walking. Take the dog, take the bike. Have some fun.
Get on the bike, yeah.
It
So
won't
if
be
you're
raining,
half
of course.
Yorkshire, what's the other half? Where do you actually come from? Then?
My mum's from Lancashire. My dad's from Bradford. He passed away 10 years ago. But grew up in Lancashire.
Thank you.
So I feel stronger on that side, but actually, blood-wise, half and half.
I was trying to work out if I could pick out an accent, yeah.
It comes back when I go home. People go two ways, don't they? They either their accent never changes wherever they are, or they adapt to wherever they end up.
My
I'm a bit on that
falls off
category.
a chair laughing whenever I meet my brother. And he's from the southeast where I grew up.
Right.
And our accents then coalesce to the southeast
Yeah.
again.
And I've got a brother in Australia. I've been there 20 years, and he has a thick Bolton accent, but mine diluted on the way.
So Bolton accent, are you a Wanderers fan?
No, Man City actually, because that's where my dad took me to watch the football. But obviously a soft spot for Bolton.
Well, Pete will be disappointed. He's a big Wanderers fan. He's editing to
no. I hope they get back to the Championship. They really need to be there.
Good luck to them.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I suppose we better do a podcast.
Yeah, let's do it.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow. Every week we try and come up with something else interesting or useful for owners and managers of small and medium-sized enterprises, just to try and help you on your journey for growth. And if you've skimmed down the list of titles and found this week's episode, you'll see we have a guest who I'm going to introduce. And today's subject will be wide-ranging, but the main point I'm really interested in around talking to Andy about is how do you find a successor when you are the founder of an organisation. So joining me today, welcome very much to the programme, Andrew Jowett.
Hi,
Thanks for coming in. Very brave of you to come in and tell us all about the history of the charity.
No, it's nice to be able to do that.
Well, it's something I know you're very, very proud of. You know, you set something up from its beginnings and then, as we just said in the intro there, took it right to the point of handing on the reins to somebody else, which must almost be like seeing your kid leave home or something. Yeah,
there's lots of analogies to having children and sort of letting them go. But that's right. I'm sort of the end of my career now, but most of it has been in the not-for-profit sector.
So tell us a bit about the charity itself then and how you got into it.
So I got involved with a group of business people actually from the West Midlands looking to develop what they call appropriate technologies, sort of machinery that can be used where there's no power, for example, in Africa particularly. And one thing led to another, and we launched a new organisation to promote sustainable building technologies in Africa. That was about 16 years ago. And my background was in Africa, and I was ready for a change, so that all fell into place.
So what had you done before then? You say your background.
Yeah, well, in my 20s, I kind of did lots of jobs that my wife still doesn't know about, including sailing in the Caribbean for a year.
Oh, lovely.
Worked in the city for 2 years. That wasn't for me. Did a master's, and then I worked for Save the Children for 8 to 9 years in Africa and Latin America. Came back to the UK with young children. And got hired to run an agriculture organisation working in Africa, but headquartered in Telford actually. So we moved up to Shropshire.
Came here.
Yeah, did that for 10 years, and then after a couple of years, sort of transition, we got stuck into creating and build it international.
So this came about then through a group of business people that you were talking to.
Who I had some connection with, but I've been asked to join the working party.
So at the beginning, it was absolutely from scratch.
Yeah, absolutely from scratch. But we spotted a space in the market, if you like, where I was familiar with working, particularly in Southern Africa. And we thought we had enough of a case to make a proposal that would attract support. But out of this working group, I was the one who dropped off and said, okay, I'll make it work. Quite a risky thing to do,
definitely,
with children at school and what have you. Got a bit of initial funding to pay for some of my time.
So how does that model work? For those of us listening that are more in the private sector world and not having been used to the non-profit sector and the charity sector in particular, how do you even start something like that, knowing, where's the funding going to come from and whatever your purpose is, how do you attract?
Well, so there are lots of people out there, and in fact the third sector, which is often described as a not-for-profit world, is incredibly creative. There are a lot of amazing people, often under the radar, finding solutions either very community-based or much bigger to the sort of social problems, often around employment or health issues or education. And there's a world of funding for that sort of work, quite a lot of private money. often through what we call grant making, trusts and foundations. So these are charities that are set up often by wealthy people who've decided to give some of their wealth away.
So is it directly from philanthropists? Though?
Well, that's one route, and that's a good way to start because they have the freedom through their charitable vehicle, which is very tax efficient. So that's why they set them up.
Right.
You'll often find people who sell a business, if it's a substantial sum, will decide they're going to put some of the proceeds into a charity. They don't pay tax on that, and then they can start to enjoy spending the wealth they've created.
Well, that may certainly be relevant to a number of our listeners then as they look ahead to when they sell businesses.
And I'm right now, post my Build It job, I'm working for one of those people. I'm basically helping him manage his charity, which is great fun. Giving money away is great fun. And it's just, this isn't what we're going to talk about, but he spent the last 7 or 8 years and probably the next 5 or 6 years enjoying spending his wealth and supporting causes and meeting really interesting people.
Well, it must be really satisfying.
Oh, it's incredible.
There's a legacy being built.
It's quite rare, Dave. You'd be amazed how many people decide that's not the way they want to go. But
not for them, yeah.
I end up working with a lot of these people, and what I see is a huge amount of satisfaction. And they're investments. They're just not looking for a financial return, and they don't all work. Sure. But they can take a risk.
Is there a type? Having met a number of different philanthropists or people who've sold their business, can you see a common thread?
I'm careful what I say. Is there a type? Usually self-made people.
Right.
Okay. Rather than inherited wealth, I would say.
That's interesting.
So people come done well themselves from modest beginnings.
Mm-hmm. And their choice of cause, is that something often to do with their own personal experience?
Yeah, definitely. Their personal interests or their family's interests. Yeah. Don't forget their partner, their wife or their husband, because they're part of the team, even if they're not formally in the decision-making process.
Yeah. So how did it start for Build It International then?
So I got somebody I knew for that kind of profile who I knew well from my previous work. I kind of sold him the concept. And
sold him the dream.
Sold him the dream. Yeah. He knew me, had confidence in me, and that gave me kind of 2 days a week paid and enough to get going. And we got going. We decided where do we want to start, where do we want to focus, worked through that kind of basic strategy stuff. That was down in Zambia. And then I had another good meeting. I don't know if you remember Wimpy Construction that floated in the 60s.
Wow, okay.
Well, the family set up one of the biggest grant-making organisations in the UK then called the Tudor Trust. And I knew them quite well. The chief exec was an architect, actually, and was really interested in what we're doing. Okay. So he paid the other 3 days a week salary for me. Okay. But that was after 18 months.
But that was enough then to fully...
Yeah, because he said, look, this is a great idea, I love it, but unless you fully focus on it, it isn't really going to get going.
And the rationale behind it is that you're providing something that's relevant in an area that wants some support, but not... It's
employment creation. Skills development and employment creation was the rationale. Well, the original idea was actually to try... So we had a bunch of technologies to do with making tiles, making blocks, making basic building materials in a remote site that could become a small business. That didn't work, actually, because the quality control issues were too difficult.
Oh, right.
So you'd have had to accompany a small group you set up around a technology for a number of years to get it to the point where it can work. And we were looking to actually do some construction along the way, schools and clinics. Yeah. So we were constantly moving around, and that's where the money was coming in for the buildings. So we changed tack.
So it was a pivot then.
Yeah, a big moment where we'd already started to train labour on the projects because it's very unskilled labour. And then we decided to make the training the central thrust. I mean, there was a gradual process, but there was a moment we said, right, this is what we're going to concentrate on.
So it was a training organisation rather than a construction?
It became a training. It was a construction and became a training organisation. And that has led to substantial growth. We're probably the biggest training organisation in Zambia. Yeah. In the construction sector.
So given the constraints that you have from being a not-for-profit, you can't go and get investment, you can't get grants. How do you grow a business like that when you're having to make decisions that don't have an obvious ROI that you can point to or an immediate payback? How do you win that argument for people to say, I need to invest in this?
Good question. I mean, you put together a case for support, which has all the basic questions answered for people looking to support you. And then you'll put a fundraising strategy together to see where you think income's most likely to come from. And you're looking generally to have probably three income streams. So we'd have our individual supporters as you're building up a supporter base, sort of traditional charity fundraising, but that's kind of slow and steady unless you get into things like direct marketing, which is horrendously expensive and has a very long break-even period. Never went around there. Your best return on investment is often on tapping into these private grants. So that's probably your second income stream. And then with time, you want to definitely develop a third, and there's all sorts of things. We ended up going down the kind of corporate partnership route. So we got a number of corporate partnerships in place. Some quite surprising ones, actually. You'd think the affinity would be with the construction sector, but the construction sector in the UK is very UK focused, maybe with interests in the Middle East, maybe with a bit in North America. But we tied up with our friends down the road who no longer exist, Carillion.
Oh, really? There's a story.
So Carillion were the biggest private training organisation of construction skills in the UK. And so that business was, washed its face, but it was part of their mix when they were bidding for big construction contracts. We'll also train lots of people around the hospital in Liverpool or the school in Manchester or whatever. Yeah. And we had a technical support partnership with them. So we used to get trainers from them, help develop curriculum, go out to Zambia.
So they got some benefit from that as well through the training?
It was part of their CSR program, or ESG as you call it these days. Yeah. We got a number of technical support partnerships with the construction sector, but not a lot of cash. And then we hit a bit of a jackpot with the owners of comparethemarket.com.
No way, really? Okay.
Yeah, which produced £1.2 million over 7 years.
Something for you, yeah.
And gave us brilliant profile.
And how did that come about?
Well, this is a great story, actually. This is the power of social media. I'll go back a couple of steps. Rather fortuitously, we ended up getting Bryan Adams, the singer, Canadian singer. We got some money. We got some money from it.
We got some money from Bryan Adams.
We got some money from Bryan Adams.
How did that just doesn't come?
Okay, so as I explained earlier, he had created the Bryan Adams Foundation, which is a registered UK charity, and we subscribe to a mailing list where somebody monitors the creation of new charities, and you can find out. Last month, there were 10 new charities created, 10 new charities. And then we saw this one. So somebody sort of hot off the press in my office sort of contacted them. And they go, we're not ready to consider proposals. Send us something anyway. They've been registered, but there were no staff or systems. Anyway, we got in early and got
first
25 grand. Wow. And it lasted for a few years. Anyway, Bryan Adams, after 2 years of supporting us, agreed to be a patron.
Brilliant.
But I wasn't into patrons because they can often sort of do nothing. But we never had. Anyway,
it sounds like a one.
And I also got him to tweet that he was becoming a patron.
Right.
Now that was a big deal because he's got like
a lot of followers.
20 million followers. And somebody in the BGL, the Compare the Market office, in their comms marketing team, whatever, followed Bryan Adams. And it's all to do with timing, Dave. Timing.
Yep.
Timing. They were at the point of reviewing their charity support program. They had international, national, and local. They wanted some change at the international level. Have a look at these guys.
So
got
just
a phone
because
call.
Someone in the office happened to like and follow Bryan Adams.
No. Someone in their office. Yes.
In their office.
Yes.
Yeah. So they'd seen Bryan Adams' tweet saying, "I've just become."
So we get a phone call. Now, in the fundraising world, it's always you making the phone calls, right?
The phone never rings.
So the phone rings, and it's Faith, and she's saying, I'd like to know a bit more about you, and one thing led to another, and we got to pitch, and we got it. And we looked after them big time. You've got to look after your donors. And in the fundraising world, you'd be surprised how much poor practice there is out there.
And what do they need back then? You say looking after.
So so that business employed about 3,000 people across the different divisions, mainly in Compare the Market. A lot of people in call center type jobs, sort of junior type jobs, where churn is high. Particularly in that East Midlands area around Peterborough, you can go down the road and work for Thomas Cook if you're pissed off with your employer. Excuse me. Yeah. So staff retention and motivation is massive in that type of business. So they invested a huge amount in feeling good about working for the firm.
Yeah.
And so their charitable activities and support was a big part of that approach. And they would monitor their staff turn against benchmarks and reckon they could demonstrate that they were performing well.
So part of looking after them was giving them ways of being able to communicate to their staff.
So each year they'd have a big deal. They'd fundraise for a project. There'd be all sorts of things happening all over the business. You could compete to get on a trip to Africa. It was a big affair. And the beauty of it for us was we didn't really have to do that much. I mean, obviously we had to organise the trip and everything, deliver the project and feed the comms. But all those activities inside the business were driven by their team.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
And I want to wind back as well to the point you made about having these patrons in the first place. You know, you weren't that keen on the idea because it can become a bit of a burden or something.
Well, they generally don't do anything, you know.
But does that matter if someone like Bryan Adams hadn't done anything but tweets? Then you're fine, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and I got him to host a dinner once. Actually, it was a famous office. This is a brilliant story. We were in the office, our small office in Shrewsbury, and the phone rang. Is Andrew there? I'll just get him. Who's calling? Bryan Adams.
Oh, wow. Really, Bryan Adams.
Anyway, I've lost touch with him now. He's long gone. So yeah, you're trying to develop three income streams, and the key thing for those of you interested in the charity sector is a distinction between restricted income and unrestricted income or general funds.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're looking to maximize your general income.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean you can do what on earth you like with it. You've got to spend that money to fulfill your charitable objects, the reason you exist. But if the income's restricted, like for a specific project, building a school somewhere or training X number of trainees in construction skills, that's where it must be spent. So you can't spend it on something else.
No,
so if you need to generate a surplus in your unrestricted money, your general money, to allow you some headroom to invest in your team, generally speaking, and other fundraising.
So it must tie you in knots as a manager of an organisation like that. You're always having to work out which pot of money is it coming from, and am I allowed to do this with that money, or have I got this other pot that I have to do with?
Well, you have to set your financial systems up to allow for that. So every piece of income, every item of income that comes in to the bank will be tagged to a pot. Okay. And then on the spend side, you've got to make sure you're allocating expenditure against the right pot. And every month in the management accounts, I'm looking at the movement on each of these pots. So, you know, we were up to probably a dozen significant pots of money going up and down, closing out, new ones starting.
So you need the unrestricted funds to be able to grow your team.
Yeah, so strategically, in terms of your fundraising strategy, the key thing is to make sure you've got a healthy balance between restricted and unrestricted. Ideally, 100%.
Yeah, you're never going to get that, I suppose.
But generally speaking, people like to fund a project. Okay, so you're going to have to run with that. But in terms of the relationship with your funders and managing that relationship, you're trying to move people from one side of that spectrum to the others. And you can often get people to come in funding something specific, and then as you engage more, get them on board, go and see the work, understand and trust the organisation more, you can migrate across to general funds. Yeah. And I had this rule never to aim for minimum 50% unrestricted income.
And that's a conversation you can have with the donor.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I know you want to support this project, but we need to run the charity anyway, so can we have some of it unrestricted?
Yeah. And what you're trying to do is get people to buy into what you do as an organisation and trust you. So one of our biggest donors into well over seven figures over the years, and still going. I'm not there anymore, but still going. You know, it took me 18 months of meeting in London and not quite arguing, but engaging. What about corruption? What about political support? How do you know the impact? The other thing, of course, in our sector, which you've really got to get right from early on, and this was the beauty for me of being able to apply all my understanding and learning over a number of years to a new organisation. You know, I didn't have to relearn a lot of stuff. Sure. Is impact. You know, being able to demonstrate impact. So for us, we've commissioned an independent survey of sampling the people we've trained every year. Now every other year.
Is that mandatory? Is that part of what you have to do? It's just impact assessments.
Well, It's not mandatory. There's no law that says
Was it a requirement by the grant funders?
Yeah, but it's increasingly a requirement.
We've done some work with other charities before where we've been asked to do an impact assessment, and clearly it's not just because they fancy it. Someone wants to see the benefit.
Well, first of all, you want to know what your work's, the impact of your work anyway, because it's part of your learning process.
Yeah.
So there's an internal driver, but there's a strong external driver being able to actually demonstrate impact.
Right.
So since very early on, and now in its like 13th, 14th year, I can show almost a longitudinal study of the impact on people's lives of the training we're given. We actually track people for up to 5 years because,
Right. Well, wouldn't it be nice though if you could go back 15 years?
Yeah, but yes, it would. And you probably could although, whether you can track people
you lose
down.
touch with people.
You lose touch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm talking as if I'm still there. I'm not there. I left 6 months
You're still
ago,
getting used to the idea of you not being there. Yeah.
But, that's very powerful.
Yeah.
It's
Something
very
else
powerful.
I wanted to ask you about, which you'll have a different angle on, I think, from the listeners that are coming from the private sector, is around governance of an organisation like this. Presumably you had trustees, whereas private sector companies will have a board.
Or directors,
But you still have a board, but a trustee board, right? So they're not executive.
But technically they're directors as well, because most charities are registered companies as well.
So they're directors of the company. But when you're running the company, do they turn up and have like a board meeting in the sense that we'd recognise it?
Yeah, very much. Very important part of running a
But they're all non-executives.
Yes, and it's generally the case that the chief exec is not a board member.
Right.
Okay.
But attends the board meetings?
That attends the board meetings. But a good practice would be that there's an item 0 without the chief exec.
Okay.
So the board can
have a conversation if they need to.
They can have a conversation with, and that's that's good. That's good practice.
So how do you choose these board members so that they're actually adding value rather than just bragging about the fact that they're helping a charity that they're
and there's, I would say, probably for the last 20 years there's been a pretty steady professionalisation of the governance of charities, generally speaking.
Right.
So in the old days, the great and the good, councils and large organisations, lots of names on there not contributing very much was the kind of model. That's gone, and ever since I've been sort of leading an organisation, we've had smaller, quite focused skills on the board, the people who bring something specific to the organisation. So probably 8 to 10 people.
It's quite a big board. I mean, how big was the charity in terms of employees?
Yeah, so we were up to 30 to 40 employees, the turnover 1.5 million. That's gone down a bit since COVID.
But with a board of 8 to 10, that's quite a ratio, isn't it?
Yeah, yes.
But they brought
for me that felt right.
Yeah.
It's certainly a reduction from what the kind of culture was.
So you have a chair of the board that isn't you.
Absolutely. So you've got the normal functionaries. You've got a chair, secretary, and a treasurer. Although actually the company secretary doesn't have to be doesn't have to be a woman.
And that's something clearly in the corporate world larger companies are more used to. That separation of the roles of a chief exec and a chairman, very well established at senior PLC type level. Less so perhaps in small and medium sized companies.
Well,
but in a charity, it's required.
That's a critical relationship, Dave. The chief executive chair relationship's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
But the chief executive inevitably gets involved in the process. So in terms of how do you get the right people, you do some kind of skills audit, some skills profile of what you're looking for. So for us working in Africa, we wanted people with exposure.
Knowledge, yeah.
So we've had people internationally on the board.
Yeah.
And interestingly, at the moment, we had a board in Zambia because of a legal body there. For practical purposes, we've merged the two bodies. As everyone's got used to the technology of work remotely. Yeah. So now it's the diversity
More so
is there.
Since lockdown and COVID and we were
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And then you just actually possible to get rid of a trustee, or is that sort of a very hard?
Yeah, technically depends on your constitution, but there is a formal agreement and a code of practice and all those sorts of things. You should have those in place. So if you breach those, you could end up in trouble. There's also a third will rotate each year. So say we were 9, every year a third would
They're all on 3-year terms.
Drop. Yeah,
renewable.
yeah, and they don't. You don't have to renew them.
No, sure. So it makes it
but you're right. It's probably not that easy. People generally sort of fade away, and
that's the job for the chair, not the
yeah,
chief
absolutely. Yeah, the chair. So then you would go. What I guess you'd recognise would be a fairly rigorous recruitment process. Though, I mean, there are agencies out there who are often recruitment agencies recruiting for board members. Yeah, we used a thing called New Role increasingly, which is a recruitment agency. And
I think it's just fascinating that the charity sector is so far ahead in this area of having that dimension of governance very well established, very experienced. Certainly in the small and medium-sized companies we work with, clearly the ones we're actually at, we are often the non-exec chair.
Yeah, well, no, my board is full of non-execs, essentially.
But we're the unusual one. And in fact, companies are reasonably unusual still if they're in that small to medium-sized sector of even having a non-exec, let alone someone else who's chair as opposed to chief executive.
I know. I mean, I know this is a big part of your business, but I'm sure you can't underestimate, if you get the right appointments, the value they bring. You know,
I'd like to think so, and I think those clients
divorced from the internal politics. It should be able to bring good processes.
Well, that ability as well, like you say, that relationship between the chair and the chief exec is absolutely critical.
Oh, completely.
Imagine one half of that not existing. There's no check and balance. There's no sort of sounding board or someone's ability to speak truth to power or whatever, however you describe it. There needs to be that tension, that creative tension, doesn't there?
Yeah, but it also doesn't work unless you invest in the board in terms of understanding the business, maybe having an area they lead on. That might be fundraising, it might be monitoring evaluation, it might be finance, obviously, or it could do with the program delivery or partnerships. So you need to get the right people on the board, and you need to make sure. So when we, and I would always argue this, when you're looking for new board members, you have a role description, you make it clear how much time, because the culture is still that you don't pay the non-execs.
Unless you're voluntary,
And you cannot pay board members, actually, for their role as a trustee. If they do some work for the organisation because they're the best place to do that, that needs to be approved.
But they'd have an employment contract almost separate from their trustee agreement.
But it would need to be approved by the board. You can't just do it.
Yeah, declare.
Otherwise, you could have sort of fraud in that way. So it's a voluntary job. So you need to be clear what the expectations are.
All the more reason, I suppose, to find the right ones, because people must be harder to manage.
So what you want.
Well, I'm coming voluntarily anyway. I don't want to do.
And charities often make the mistake of sort of asking a friend's mate or a mate's mate or somebody they know, or taking the first person who expresses an interest. What you need to do is make it's valued. This isn't a favour you're doing us. This is a great organisation to be involved with. You've competed with others to get on the board. Build it up and make it valued. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So let's wind the clock forward then and come to the point of today's podcast, which is the whole subject of succession. When did you even start thinking about the process of you maybe not living forever and being the chief executive and thinking about life after?
Yeah. So I had a kind of 10-year view when we got going. If it was, I'm well aware, as most are, that you can become stale. And also that, I don't have a stake in the business in terms of financial stake. So I had a 10-year view, and that kind of, I have to think back now, rolled in. I was a bit slow, I have to say. Things were going okay. My chairman wasn't saying, Andrew,
time's up.
Nobody's tapping on the shoulder. Easy for them.
You could have carried on.
I could have carried on, yeah. So actually, it was about 4 years ago. We actually had, often you look internally for a successor, and I think we missed a trick when we did that. We did have an internal appointment made, and it didn't come off.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah, we went right down the kind of 6-month handover process, but the individual concerned decided not to follow it through. That's a different story. But what we hadn't done then, which we should have done, was sort of benchmark that person. It's a bit of an easy option. Often good because you know them, you know the organisation.
Well, preferable in so many other ways.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So you can sort of hire support from agencies to help you with a process to make sure that the individual you're considering is fit for the job, and would have got it anyway.
So a bit of a false start in
but
a
we
sense.
didn't do that.
But you didn't do that. So then
we go back and then we start again. We start again. So you need a plan. You need to be thinking minimum 18 months ahead.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. Probably a bit further.
And how wide did you cast your net?
Well, we appointed a recruitment agency.
Right.
We didn't self-recruit.
Who are specialists in the charity sector?
Yeah.
And with an international reach?
Yeah, doing a lot of international stuff in our sector.
Did you know at that point?
Competitive process to appoint them.
Yeah, sure. Did you know at that point that you were going to be looking for someone in theatre, or as opposed to someone residing in the UK or a Brit?
We cast the net quite wide, but it was clear that you needed to be able to be employed in the UK. Yeah.
Right. But you needed in-depth knowledge of Zambia.
Yeah, you needed experience. No, you didn't need an in-depth knowledge of Zambia, actually. But you needed in-depth knowledge of somewhere similar, the context, to understand the context. In the end, we got somebody of mixed parentage, Zambia and UK, so we had a perfect profile in a way. Yeah. But we didn't know we were going to get that when we set off.
Were you sort of flattered by the number of candidates available, or was it quite difficult to
Quite
find
tough.
a field?
I mean, these agencies, they're tapping into their existing database whilst also advertising.
Yeah.
I think there were about 30 applications. It was a fairly clear decision at the end. We second interviewed 3. So there's a whole pretty rigorous process.
There's a whole board involved in this?
No, a subcommittee.
Appointments committee of some sort. Yeah.
And I'm advising them, but I'm not actually on the decision-making panel.
Right, which is healthy for you to be removed.
Yeah.
Although as a founder, and once again in the private sector, you can't imagine that happening. The founder would be the decision maker. You would remove yourself from that process.
I was pretty involved, but not formally part of the decision making, which is right. But there are definitely certain conditions that can make this whole process much easier. First of all, is the chief exec is ready to leave.
Yes, if you'd have been reluctant, that would have been very difficult.
I mean, that's important. And part of that is knowing what you're going to do next.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's just a big hole.
Yeah, do you think, and I come across this with some clients at the moment, do you think the chief exec even necessarily knows when they're ready to leave? They may think they're ready to leave, but only when they start the process and it becomes real, they think, well, maybe I'm not ready to leave after all. This is now going to happen. You know, I was happy saying that I wanted to leave until it looks like I've got 6 months to go.
Well, I don't know, because I've only got a case study of one. And I was definitely ready to move on, especially having gone through the supported episode. I came out of that pretty tired. I thought something was going to happen. It didn't. And all of a sudden, I'm back to my, 8-10-hour days. Yeah. So that box was ticked.
Right.
Yeah. Even though I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, in fact, things have fallen into place. So that's fine.
So you found a great candidate. You liked the candidate. The board liked the candidate.
Yeah.
You had no reservations. You were ready to move on.
All the triangulation, yeah.
But there's still the actual nitty-gritty of what you'd already gone through once before for your 6-month handover.
Yeah.
We are starting to realise that this is no longer going to be yours.
Yeah.
This new person will make different decisions to the ones that you have made.
So a few things in that. First of all, I've always had an executive coach. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the kind of coaching, after a fairly intense period of coaching, when you do all your appraisals and feedback and you identify your areas you need to work on, it became more of an advisory mentor type thing. But we upped the game on that for this whole process of getting ready for and executing and following through the succession. So I've got a coach helping me deal with some of the issues. Because
would you recommend that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think.
And is that someone you knew from a long while back, or?
Yeah, because he'd been my coach for 7 or 8 years.
Okay.
So he knew me very well.
In this role, though, you hadn't used one before.
No, so yes, I hadn't had a coach prior to that. No. So late on in my career, I realised the value, and that was one of my board members who suggested it. I think there'd been whatever shoes come up there, and I not everybody believes in coaches, but for me it worked well.
Did you initially warm to the idea, or were you sceptical?
Now, I was a little bit nudged into it. Mm-hmm. Interviewed 3 people for the role. Mm-hmm. We also got them done pro bono, which was quite nice. The first phase, for those of you who've been through coaching will know, can be pretty tough. Mm. There's there can be some hard messages
surfacing all those issues.
Yeah, and your style, your management style particularly. Are you a good listener? Do you know how collaborative are you? You might think you are, but that's not necessarily how everybody else thinks you are.
Get everybody's feedback.
So yeah, and then the working through the techniques and skills and awarenesses to get better at those areas, and particularly not defaulting to your weaker characteristics when you're under pressure.
So you credit the fact that you had a coach as being one of the instrumental factors that helped you then to manage that transition when the new chief exec came.
I mean, I was ready to leave, so it wasn't like I was resisting things, but nevertheless, it was great to have coach in place.
Yeah, I was just interested, as I said in my question there, that the principle of handing over to somebody else may be well established and you're comfortable with it. It's when the rubber hits the road and they start making decisions or doing things that you know.
Okay, so then you got, we had, in the end, it was 3 weeks, there was a 3 week handover.
3 week handover.
Yeah.
Not your 6 months that you.
No. So the appointment, it was just September last year. So my successor, Tom, started early September, and I exited formally at the end of September. But the last week of that was bits of holiday and writing up my handover notes and stuff like that.
You were there in case.
Yeah, and what we did was we structured the functions. We mapped out the functions of the role, went through each function, and then kind of handed over that function.
Kind of a stepwise
handover. But over a fairly intense period.
Yeah.
But it included a trip to Africa, so that was a key part of the
so you would advise anybody else in a similar circumstance to be fairly structured, of course, but don't drag
have a plan. Don't drag it out. No, and because I was the founder, and because quite a lot of the key relationships I was part of, you don't, in terms of risk management, want to lose that as the transition starts to be implemented. Yeah. So part of the getting things right was an agreed role for me, the ex-CEO, going on. So I've got this sort of ambassador title and two things really, kind of 1 year agreement and some rules of the game. Yeah. Particularly in terms of communication. Yeah. So there's a kind of call down arrangement, so he can contact me if he wants input on something or comments on something.
So you're still involved in some way.
So I probably had half a dozen conversations with my successor. They're kind of reducing, and then we had various set piece events during the year. Big donor dinner and what have you. So
you get wheeled out, do you?
I get wheeled out. I get wheeled out. I get the brief. Dust me off.
Say this, don't say that.
Yeah, and it's all about risk management, really.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
But that transition, you would say, has gone well.
But Dave, I've got to behave myself, right?
It's on the show now, right?
Exactly. And of course, for me, the massive driver, Dave, is that having invested so much of myself in creating a new organisation, seeing it through to a fairly mature stage,
muck it up, right?
I do not want it to fail.
No,
I'm totally aligned with it succeeding.
Yeah.
So my job is to help him succeed in his job. It doesn't really matter whether I agree with every decision he's making. The bigger picture is much more important. Yeah. I don't want my epitaph to be, he ran a great organisation for 15 years that it crashed.
Yeah, but it was so good.
I want it to be, I ran a great organisation and look at it now.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point that I wonder whether everybody would say that. I want it to succeed. I'm here. I've built up so much.
Oh,
but there's some sort of niggly little thought that, I wouldn't have done it. No one else actually is quite as good as me. So if it doesn't do as well after I've left, that just proves that
I'm beyond all that, Dave. It's all right.
Good. Well, I definitely wish Tom all the best in taking over the role. How do you feel now, 6 months out?
There's a sense of liberation, actually. The last few years were tough. COVID was tough for many charities. We got an initial boost in that 2020 year because we couldn't spend money, but people said, you've got to support my favourite charity. Yeah. So we had a surplus. But that started to fade, 21, 22, income was down. We ran down our surpluses, still compliant with our reserves policy. Yeah. And it's quite a tough world out there on the income side. Yeah. So, after doing that for 15, 16 years, whatever it was, liberated. I'm liberated from that. Right. So,
and you're keeping busy?
Yeah, I've set myself up as a charity advisor. I'm working about 3 days a week, which is what I'm keen to do. Other things to do as well.
Doing lots of podcasts?
Well, doing podcasts. And I'm advising this grant maker, which is a lot of fun.
That sounds like great fun.
Love it.
Yeah, great.
Giving money away.
Good. Well, look, thank you very much, Andy, for coming in and talking to us. Fascinating story. Who knew that Bryan Adams would crop up somewhere in that narrative? Superb. So thanks for coming in.
It's been nice to be here. Thank you.
That's great. So thank you again for listening to another episode of the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow. Every week we try and come up with something interesting and useful, and I think you'll agree this week it's been something a little bit different, but hopefully very thought-provoking for owners and senior managers of small and medium-sized enterprises, either on the subject of succession of your own role, or maybe what you do afterwards if you're looking to have some sort of philanthropic element to your legacy. So thanks for listening, and please tell your friends that we're here. Follow us on whatever podcast channel you found us on. Drop someone an email, tell them in the pub. And anyway, and in the meantime, good luck with your business.